Let's start with a simple truth. Your brain isn't broken, it's just stuck. Stuck in habits, stuck in thought loops that keep you from reaching your potential. And here's the kicker, most of us don't even realize it. We think willpower alone can fix this, but that's like trying to fix a car engine by just yelling at it. So, how do you FCK your brain? How do you reprogram the hardware and software to stop sabotaging yourself? The answer lies in a method that's brutal, but effective, inspired by people like David Goggins, who have mastered the science of mental resilience through discomfort. Our brains are wired to seek patterns and conserve energy. This means that when something becomes familiar, even if it's harmful or unproductive, our brains tend to stick with it because it's safe in a neurological sense. This default state often traps us in negative feedback loops, where the same thoughts, feelings, and behaviors repeat over and over. For example, if you constantly tell yourself you're not good enough or that you'll fail, your brain starts to accept that as its baseline reality. This repeated cycle of self-doubt and avoidance becomes a habit that feels automatic, almost like autopilot. The problem is, these patterns are self-reinforcing. The more you engage in negative thinking, the stronger those neural connections become, making it even harder to break free. What's critical to understand is that the brain doesn't distinguish between helpful and harmful patterns. It only reinforces whatever you feed it regularly. So, if your default is stuck in negativity, simply willing yourself to think positively won't change those deep, ingrained pathways overnight. Instead, your brain needs real, consistent input to rewire itself, a process called neuroplasticity. This rewiring requires targeted effort to interrupt those automatic loops and create new, healthier patterns. Without this understanding, many people fall into frustration or give up because they expect change to happen quickly or by sheer force of will alone. Recognizing that your brain is in this default state is the first step. Once you see that these unproductive loops are just habits, neurological grooves carved from repetition, you realize that change is possible. But it requires more than just thinking differently. It requires taking actions that physically alter your brain's wiring. This is where strategies that combine mental effort with physical challenge come into play, because the brain responds best when multiple systems are engaged together. This fundamental insight sets the stage for fucking your brain, because it reveals why conventional advice, just think positive or try harder, often fails. Your brain isn't broken. It's just stuck in an old, ineffective operating mode, waiting for you to give it a new, stronger signal to switch gears. The brain's default mode is to protect you by sticking to familiar patterns, even if those patterns are harmful or limiting. When you find yourself caught in cycles of negative thinking or behavior, it's because your brain is running on autopilot, replaying the same mental scripts over and over. These are called negative feedback loops, processes where your brain reinforces certain thoughts or actions by rewarding itself with familiar neurochemical signals. For instance, when anxiety or doubt arises, you might avoid the challenge that triggered those feelings, and the brain registers that avoidance as relief. Over time, this relief becomes a reward, strengthening the habit of running away from discomfort rather than confronting it. This autopilot mode is why breaking free from unproductive mental states isn't as simple as deciding to just be positive. Your brain's wiring is deep and habitual, shaped by years of repeated thoughts, emotions, and reactions. In other words, the brain isn't wired to change just because you want it to. It needs new experiences and consistent effort to reshape those pathways. This explains why willpower alone often fails. The brain craves familiarity and resists change because it's energetically expensive to rewire itself. Understanding this is crucial because it shifts your perspective from blaming yourself to recognizing the mechanics behind your behavior. Your negative patterns are not personal failings. They are survival strategies that once served a purpose, but now keep you stuck. The key to fucking your brain lies in deliberately interrupting these feedback loops. By introducing new, challenging stimuli and consistent habits, you force the brain to create fresh neural connections. This is how neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, works. It doesn't happen overnight, but with focused effort, you can change those default states and reprogram your mind for resilience and growth. At its core, your brain operates on a principle of efficiency. It's constantly trying to minimize effort and conserve energy. This is why it quickly develops habitual patterns of thought and behavior, even if those patterns aren't serving your best interests. When negative feedback loops form, they essentially become a loop of self-reinforcement. For example, if you experience stress and your immediate response is to shut down or avoid the source, your brain tags that reaction as the path of least resistance. Over time, the brain strengthens the neural pathways associated with avoidance, making it easier and more automatic to choose the same reaction in future situations. This loop can be incredibly hard to break because the brain is wired to seek out the familiar and avoid uncertainty. It's a survival mechanism rooted in our evolutionary past. Sticking to known behaviors increased chances of survival. Unfortunately, in modern life, these mechanisms can work against us, trapping us in cycles of procrastination, anxiety, or self-doubt. Even when you consciously want to change, the subconscious brain often pulls you back into these loops because it perceives the old behavior as safer. The problem is compounded because these negative feedback loops don't just affect your thoughts. They influence your emotions, physiology, and behavior simultaneously. When trapped in this loop, your brain can generate a flood of stress hormones like cortisol, which further impair your ability to think clearly and make decisions. This creates a vicious cycle where your brain interprets challenges as threats and reinforces avoidance or self-sabotage as a way to cope. Breaking free from these loops requires more than motivation. It requires rewiring your brain's underlying architecture through deliberate, repeated actions that create new neural connections. This is the science behind neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to change its wiring based on experience. When you consistently engage in behaviors that challenge your old patterns, like pushing through discomfort instead of avoiding it, your brain begins to form new pathways that favor resilience and growth. This process shifts your brain's default state from one of automatic negativity to one of intentional, empowered action. Understanding this cycle is crucial because it helps you realize that your current mental state isn't fixed. It's a learned pattern that can be unlearned. With awareness and strategic effort, you can interrupt the negative feedback loops and train your brain to respond differently, giving you control over your thoughts, emotions, and actions instead of being controlled by them. The brain's reliance on default states and negative feedback loops isn't just about habit, it's about survival wiring that has been ingrained over millions of years. This hardwired system is designed to keep you safe by minimizing exposure to risk and uncertainty. When faced with stress or challenge, your brain instinctively activates pathways that trigger familiar reactions, even if those reactions limit your potential. For example, if you've repeatedly faced failure or disappointment, your brain might preemptively trigger feelings of doubt or fear when you approach similar situations, reinforcing a loop of hesitation and avoidance. What makes these loops particularly powerful is their self-perpetuating nature. The brain seeks to maintain homeostasis, a balanced internal state. When negative emotions or thoughts arise, the brain looks for ways to restore this balance, often by retreating to known, comfortable behaviors. This retreat feels like relief, and that relief acts as a reward, further solidifying the cycle. It's why, paradoxically, your brain can become addicted to negative thinking or destructive habits. They provide a predictable emotional outcome, even if it's not a positive one. Moreover, these feedback loops are deeply tied to your brain's neurochemical environment. Chemicals like dopamine, cortisol, and serotonin fluctuate based on your experiences and behaviors, influencing your mood and motivation. When stuck in negative loops, your brain's chemistry reinforces states like anxiety or lethargy, making it increasingly difficult to break free. This chemical reinforcement creates a biological barrier to change, which is why willpower alone often feels insufficient. The good news is that understanding this biological basis gives you a roadmap for change. It means that to fuck your brain, you have to intentionally disrupt these loops with new experiences that create different neurochemical responses. This might look like seeking out controlled stressors, engaging in physical movement, or practicing focused attention to retrain your brain's reward system. Over time, these interventions strengthen new neural pathways, gradually shifting your brain's default state from one of stagnation to one of growth and resilience. By recognizing the science behind your brain's default mode and negative feedback loops, you gain the power to approach mental change not as a battle of will, but as a process of rewiring and recondition, in turning your brain's natural tendencies into allies rather than enemies in your quest. Mental clarity and strength. The default state of the brain is heavily influenced by its need to maintain a sense of predictability and control. This is why, when faced with new or challenging experiences, the brain often defaults to familiar patterns, even if those patterns hold us back. These patterns create feedback loops where the brain continuously reinforces its own beliefs and behaviors, making change feel like an uphill battle. For example, if you constantly respond to stress by withdrawing or procrastinating, your brain learns to associate those responses with safety and comfort, even though they may actually prevent growth or success. These feedback loops don't just affect your thoughts. They influence how your brain processes information and regulates your emotions. When trapped in a negative loop, your brain's perception becomes skewed. You might start to interpret neutral or even positive situations through a lens of doubt, fear, or pessimism. This distorted view reinforces the loop, making it harder to see alternatives or possibilities for change. In essence, your brain creates a tunnel vision effect, where it filters out information that contradicts the established pattern and magnifies anything that confirms it. At the neurochemical level, these loops are tied to the release of neurotransmitters and hormones that regulate mood and motivation. Chronic activation of negative feedback loops can lead to imbalances, such as elevated cortisol from prolonged stress, that impair cognitive function and emotional regulation. This biological feedback further entrenches the patterns, making it feel nearly impossible to break free just by thinking differently. To overcome this, it's essential to understand that your brain's default state isn't fixed. It is malleable and capable of change through the process of neuroplasticity, where new experiences and repeated actions can reshape neural pathways. Interrupting negative feedback loops requires conscious effort to introduce new, positive stimuli that create different emotional and chemical responses in the brain. This could be as simple as taking on a small challenge, practicing focused breathing to calm the nervous system, or engaging in physical activity that shifts brain chemistry. By appreciating how deeply these loops are wired into your brain's default operations, you can approach mental change with patience and strategy, knowing that every intentional action you take is slowly but surely retraining your brain to favor growth, resilience, and clarity over fear and stagnation. One of the most important realities about the brain's default state is that it favors ease and familiarity over effort and change. This means that your brain will naturally resist attempts to alter long, standing habits and thought patterns because change requires energy and creates uncertainty. Negative feedback loops become deeply entrenched because the brain has learned that these familiar responses help maintain a predictable internal environment. Even if those responses limit your potential or cause distress, they feel safer than the unknown. This resistance to change explains why motivation alone rarely leads to lasting transformation. Motivation is often fleeting. It can spike briefly but then vanish, leaving you vulnerable to falling back into old patterns. The brain, craving stability, quickly pulls you back into the comfort zone of habitual behavior. What's needed instead is consistency, repeated, deliberate actions that don't rely on how you feel in the moment, but build new neural pathways over time. This repetition signals to your brain that the new pattern is becoming the new normal, slowly weakening the hold of the negative loops. Additionally, the internal narrative or self-talk your brain generates plays a powerful role in either reinforcing or breaking these loops. When stuck in negative feedback loops, your internal voice often becomes critical, doubtful, and discouraging. This internal dialogue amplifies the brain's resistance to change by validating the old patterns as true or safe. Reprogramming this voice requires sustained effort and strategies that combine mental focus with physical triggers, like breath control or exercise, to create a new baseline for how your brain interprets challenges and setbacks. Neuroscience shows that this process of rewiring isn't instantaneous. It requires time, patience, and a system of support, whether that's through habits, environments, or communities that encourage growth. But the key takeaway is that the brain's default state can be changed. By understanding the nature of negative feedback loops and the brain's preference for familiarity, you can develop the tools to interrupt these cycles, replace them with healthier ones, and ultimately reclaim control over your mental landscape. This is the foundation of fucking your brain, recognizing that your current mindset is not your destiny, but rather a learned pattern that you have the power to transform through consistent, purposeful effort. To sum it all up, fucking your brain is not about quick fixes or magical thinking. It's about understanding how your brain's default states and negative feedback loops keep you stuck, and then deliberately rewiring those patterns through sustained, intentional effort. It means leaning into controlled discomfort, hacking your brain's reward system, and building small, consistent wins that compound over time. It means using your body, through breath, movement, and challenge, to shift your mental state instantly. And above all, it means choosing consistency over motivation, rewriting your internal narrative until I can't becomes I will. Your brain is incredibly powerful, but it's also incredibly adaptable. The patterns that have held you back are not permanent, they are habits that can be broken, replaced, and transformed. The path isn't easy, but the science is clear. With understanding, discipline, and persistence, you can reset your brain's operating system and unlock a level of mental clarity, resilience, and focus you never thought possible. So don't wait for motivation or inspiration to magically strike. Start today, start small, and commit to the process. Because once you take control of your brain, you take control of your life.